Hello and welcome to another verse of the day. Today's verse is 1 Corinthians 1:24, and I would like to describe this verse as deceptively simple. It's simple because we don't have any real challenges grammatically in terms of participles or infinitives or subjunctives or conditional clauses or all those many fun things that make the language challenging. On the other hand, it's so simple that if I were to ask you, what's the main verb of this sentence? Can you find it? No, there actually isn't a main verb here. And so the next step might be to assume there's going to be an implied verb, like an a-me verb, and then to just look for the subject. But again, if we look at each of these words, we won't find a noun in the nominative case. So with no subject and no verb, then what we're left to do in trying to translate this verse is to say, okay, well then how do all of these phrases relate to what we have in the previous verse? Because in the previous verse, we do have a main verb, we preach, and we do have a subject. And we also have our direct object here, Christon, and our participle, which is modifying the direct object. We've got the datives here, to the Jews, to the Gentiles, and we've got these accusatives of apposition, which are kind of renaming Christ crucified. But we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. So our question then in translating verse 24 is, how are these phrases going to relate to the previous verse? Also, before we move on to our translation, I'd like to point out one word you may not recognize. This is an adjective. It comes from kletos, and it means called or invited. Now please pause the video, take some time to translate, and then we'll work through it together. Okay, so notice that as we start a translation here, this first word, this third person personal pronoun, is dative plural, just like these two words here were dative plural. So what we have is first one group being mentioned, the Jews, then we have another group, the Gentiles, and now we have a third group, to those. And our adjective called agrees with the word those in number, case, and gender, so we know that it's modifying those, but to those called. And then these two words are also dative plural, both Jews and Greeks. These are also both renaming those, but to those called, both Jews and Greeks. And the de here is showing that a contrast is taking place between these first two groups, which for some reason or other have rejected Christ crucified, and this third group, which has accepted him. So now as we move on to translate the last phrase, we notice a pattern has emerged. Dative, accusative, dative, accusative, dative, accusative. And just as the accusatives here were in apposition to Christ crucified, so the accusative here is also in apposition, renaming the name Christ, and then describing him differently as to how he is understood by those who are called. These two accusatives modify the word Christ, very similar to how the participle here modified the word Christ. And then we have our genitives of God, which modify the accusatives. So let's try our translation. But to those called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So again, note the contrast. To the Jews, Christ crucified was a stumbling block. To the Gentiles, Christ crucified was foolishness. But to those who are being saved, Christ crucified is the power of God and the wisdom of God. And so in some English translations, we will still supply a be verb just to smooth out the meaning. And that is our verse for the day.